Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to chapter 20 about Esther, the Queen of Beauty and Courage. I talk about it as how to step into your divine destiny. And this is just such an incredible story of a little orphan girl who becomes the first lady of the most powerful nation in the world and who literally saves the messianic line in God's bigger story. What is so interesting about this book is that it starts off with no real mention of God. There's never in the whole book a mention of God's name. And the other thing you notice is there's not really any what you would see as spectacular miracles. There's not the crossing of a Red Sea. And part of what the whole purpose of this book is to see that God is not only present in the spectacular or the extraordinary, God is also at work in the obscure and the ordinary. God is at work when you don't see Him. God is at work when it looks like everything is going against you. And I think that's important because some of you are in that place right now. And God wants us to be aware and have faith and look for how He's working in the dark places, in the places where it seems and feels like everything's a disaster, like you're within a rock and a hard place. You know what that's like? And yet God is at work. I saw the word, God is nowhere. And then I saw someone take that word, God is nowhere, and just separate the W from the H. And the same word said, God is now here. And it all depends on whether you have eyes to see. I refer in this story, and we'll get to it, but it's an amazing story about, I call them the Kairos moments or the breakthrough moments in our life that come in many areas. And it's not whether we're strong enough or smart enough, it's whether we're ready to seize those moments. Someone said a kairos or a divine moment is when preparation meets providence. And when we sense God moving and we're willing to step into that, then our world changes and the world around us changes. I always like this quote by Winston Churchill, who said, there comes a special moment in everyone's life, a moment in which that person was made and born for. That special opportunity of which when he or she seizes it will fulfill his or her mission, a mission for which he is uniquely qualified. It is that moment in which he finds his greatness. That is his finest hour. And we're going to read about Esther's finest hour because she recognizes the divine moment and steps into it. The story starts kind of strange. We have this man named King Xerxes, and you in history might recognize him if you saw the movie 300. This is the king who's now the king of Persia, who goes up against 300 Spartans and loses 20,000 men. With all of his wars going on, he needs to raise a lot of funds. And so one thing he does is he has these huge banquets. And when we start the story, he's in the middle of one of these, and it's a 6-month banquet. And at the end, when they're all drunk, he invites his wife, the queen, Vashti, to come and somehow parade her sexual beauty as she refuses to come. And he's furious. And he listens to these advisors, and they say, boy, you can't let her get away with that. No telling what the rest of the wives will do. You need to get rid of her and find a new queen. And so we have the next chapter, which is sort of like the BC version of The Bachelor, in which there is King Xerxes has this giant beauty pageant. Now, at this point, we know from last week's study, about 70,000 Jews have gone back to Jerusalem, but many thousands remained and sort of assimilated into the culture, including a man named Mordecai and his cousin Hadassah. who we find out was much younger than Mordecai and was his cousin, and he literally adopts her. She was an orphan girl and changes her name to the Persian name, Esther. And she is very beautiful. And so sure enough, she gets picked for this beauty pageant. And when she goes, they have 6 months of treatment before the beauty pageant. You know, some of you husbands say, you think your wife takes a long time to get ready to go out. This really took long. But anyhow, she wins the favor of the eunuch watching her. She is one of those, as is Mordecai, who witnesses by her actions and her attitudes. She sows seed, which will do her very well. And she wins the beauty contest and becomes Queen Esther. Now, in the meantime, there is this subplot, this man named Haman. He's sort of the Hitler of the Old Testament. And he hates the Jews. Jewish history says that he was a descendant of King Agag. He was the Amalekite king that Saul had spared. The Amalekites were the arch enemies of the Jews because they had been the ones to oppose them coming into the promised land. And Saul was supposed to eradicate them, but he left a few alive, including King Agag. And so now this Haman is on the scene, and he hates the Jews. And there's one Jew who he especially hates, and that is Mordecai. Well, Haman ends up becoming the prime minister of all of Persia. And one day, he walks past Mordecai, and he's the only one who won't bow to Haman. And this enrages Haman. Now, one of the things is Mordecai has never had told Esther, don't tell anyone we're related or that you're a Jew. So none of those dots get put together. But he decides he doesn't just want to get rid of Mordecai. He wants to wipe out all the Jews. And so he gets permission from Xerxes, and he gets him to agree to put in an unbreakable covenant that there will be a day that all of the Jews can be wiped out. And they do something called casting the pur. The pur in that language meant casting the dice. And the dice comes up with the day 11 months away, somewhere between February and March, which is the day of Pur, where all of the Jews will be annihilated or genocide will take place. Can you imagine how horrible it was for the Jews in Persia to live with that death sentence, like being on death row? And in the meantime, some other interesting things happen. Mordecai uncovers a plot to have the king assassinated. And he secretly tells Esther, who warns King Xerxes. Sure enough, that checks out. And they arrest those guys. And basically the king is saved and does nothing about it. Well, as all this is developing, the news gets to Mordecai. And he sets up a private meeting with Esther, basically to ask her to go into the king and intervene. Well, the tradition of that day, Esther says, hey, this is not as easy as it sounds, because unless the king summons me, I could be killed if I go in before the king without being summoned. And, she realizes how Vashti, what happened to her? If, the king's pretty moody. And then we get to the main text that we are looking at today, and that is in Esther chapter 4, beginning with verse 12 through 16. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this, those famous words, for such a time, or for an appointed time, or for a kairos moment, or for your divine destiny, your date with divine destiny. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. and I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Some more famous words. If I perish, I perish. Well, they fast and pray. In the meantime, an interesting thing happens. A quote, coincidence. One night, King Xerxes can't sleep, so he gets up and he has some of the records read, and they read the record of how Mordecai had saved his life. And he asks, well, what has been done for Mordecai for this good deed? And they said, nothing at all. He's pondering what to do, and it's morning now, and it just so happens that Haman walks in the door, and the king asks, what should be done for the king, for the man that the king wants to honor? And of course, Haman, he's full of pride. He's such an egoist. He thinks, oh, for sure, king's talking about me. And so he says, well, you should put him on your horse and let him wear the royal robes and be paraded through the streets and it announced, this is what shall be done for the man that the king wants to honor. And King Xerxes says, great idea. Go get Mordecai and do this for him, and you lead him through the streets. At that moment, Haman had the feeling the tables were turning. Well, we find that Esther takes the plunge, and she stands before the door of the king, and the king sees her with favor and invites her to come in. And he says, Esther, whatever you ask, I'll give you, up to half the kingdom. And because she's prayed and fasted, she has a very wise answer. She says, no, this is what I want. I want to know if you and Haman could come to a special banquet in your honor that I want to prepare tomorrow. And the king says, of course, and tells Haman. And so sure enough, the time arrives and they have the banquet, and he says, okay, Esther, what do you want me to give you? Up to half your kingdom. And she says, what I want is you to spare my life and the life of my people. For they have been doomed, and an edict has been made to have them put to death. And the king says, what are we talking about? What such an evil man would do that to destroy you and your people? And there Esther says, Haman, he's the man. The king is furious. He goes out of the room. Haman starts begging for his life. King comes back in and thinks he's attacking Esther and says, away with him. By the way, Haman had already built a 70-foot gallows to hang Mordecai. He gets hung on the gallows instead. And the tables completely turn. Mordecai ends up getting Haman's place, all of his inheritance, all of his wealth, all of his riches. Now, there's still that little problem of the edict that had been written. And so they come up with a plan that days before that day of vengeance on the Jews will have a chance to get rid of their enemies. And 70,000 of them were taken out. And it ends up being a glorious victory. And from that day to this, the Jews celebrate that day called the Day of Purim and the Feast of Purim. This story is incredible. And it speaks probably as clearly as any story we'll ever see about the upper and lower story. In the upper story, everything looks terrible. In the upper story, it looks like there's no God anywhere. Why is Esther an orphan? And why does the enemy of the Jew become prime minister? And why does this disastrous thing happen a day to annihilate the Jews? From the lower story point of view, it looks like death. But God, of course, has this upper story. And the upper story is that when we obey him, when we step in obedience into what he calls us to, he is going to turn the tables. And we see in the big picture of the story of the Bible that this is exactly what happens with Jesus. Satan throws the dice before Adam and Eve. He gets them to sin. And as a result, hell and death and Satan take over the world. But another Adam, Jesus, comes. And through this one man's obedience, he dies on the cross for us. As the result of his obedience, what happens? We go to the end of the book of the Bible, Revelation, and we see that hell, Satan, death get thrown in the lake of fire. And Jesus and all of us get to sit on the throne forever. God turns the tables when we're obedient, when we step into our destiny. What are the lessons? There's so many lessons in this story. But the big lesson I want to point out is that there are these breakthrough moments, these divine moments of destiny. And not just one big one like we see in Esther. The truth is, in our Christian life, God has kairos moments with each of our children. Maybe in our vocation, maybe in our schooling, certainly in our personal walk with Him. For some of you, going to the encounter retreat was a kairos moment. He has them for your calling in a ministry, in your job, in your career. These moments that when you step into them, heaven comes to earth. Lives are changed. You fulfill a mission that was your purpose for being put on the earth for. Heaven gets bigger. Lives forever are different. How do we step, like I said, into those moments where your preparation and God's providence meet? Number one, we see obviously the humility of Esther and Mordecai. They were seeking to do God's will. You know, the Bible says, Romans 8:28, all things will work together for good to those who love God and are called according to His purpose. It doesn't just say all things work together for good. It says for those who seek in every way to organize their life around doing God's will, who seek to put God first. You know, most of the most important assignments God has for us, we don't know what they are. We don't foresee them. He doesn't tell us. He didn't tell Esther, yes, you're going to become queen, and I made you beautiful so that someday when all the Jews are about to be annihilated, you can talk to a king and get them free. Most of the greatest opportunities of your life, you don't see them coming. If God told you in advance, you'd probably mess it up. God never told Joseph, yes, you're going to go and be a slave. But the key is your response in all of those circumstances of life. Every time we say, God, not my will, but yours be done. In the everyday circumstance, we submit our will. We obey God. We respond, even though it looks like things that are going against us. We do what Christ would want us to do. We don't realize it, but we are positioning ourselves for something bigger than we ever imagined, being a part of God's upper story. Secondly, I just want to underline the importance of being faithful in little things. Kairos moments, big moments, come because of a bunch of little moments. We do little faithful things. What would have happened if Mordecai hadn't been faithful to raise Esther the way she was raised, to help expose a plot against the king? What would have happened if Esther had not received the wisdom of her mentor, Mordecai? What if she had blown it, that she told everyone she was a Jew? What if she had not done what he said? It's our faithfulness when we don't know that it's going to be a big deal that prepares us. David, when he was being faithful to protect sheep from the lion, he didn't realize that was preparing him for his kairos moment with Goliath. I mentioned in a sermon a few weeks ago when I decided to break up and not date a girl who was compromised and not fully committed to Christ, that just by being obedient, that would mean 6 months later I would meet my wife Sharon and would have that. The most important moments in your life come before the biggest moments. You decide to be obedient. You decide to forgive someone. You decide to tithe. You decide to share your faith. And that prepares you for that big moment that God has. A third thing is you dare to believe, in spite of your circumstances, that God is in control. I love Mordecai's word when he said to Esther, he says, God will deliver the Jews. In other words, God is in control of this situation. The only question is, are you going to get to be a part of his divine plan? Or are you going to be a bystander who actually just loses your life because you wouldn't step into God's will? he believed something glorious that we can believe today. And that is, God is at work when you don't see him. That if you are obedient, you can be sure that no matter what's happening right now, God is going to set a table before you in the presence of your enemies. That no matter what happens right now, if you're obedient, that God is going to have the final word. And that it's not over till God plays his hand. It's not over until God shows up on the scene. And when he shows up, everything changes. Can you believe now, when everything looks at its darkest, can you look at your circumstance right now that you regret, that you're saying, God, where were you there? And why weren't you there? And I don't see you anywhere. In those circumstances, can you still have faith? God will deliver me. Just like Daniel and the lions did, or the 3 Hebrew children. Our God is able to deliver us. Those moments of faith prepare us for moments of breakthrough. And then do we have settled convictions? I just love this word of Esther, where she had to come to grips. I might perish if I obey God in this situation. You see, Kairos moments always require steps of courage, steps of faith. It is what Churchill is talking about. There comes a moment, and you got to step into that moment. That little step that goes completely against what you feel, what feels safe, what feels comfortable. That critical moment in which you speak up for Christ, you stand up for your convictions, you turn against the popular tide, you risk doing something that could cost you your job or your family or even your life. And what Esther had is something so important. Jesus would say it this way in Matthew 11:29. He would say, whoever tries to save his life will lose it, but whoever is willing to lose their life for my sake will find it. Are there things that you have settled in your heart that you are going to do come hell or high water? These convictions, my integrity, my obedience, my witness, I'm going to be faithful. Jesus said there are some people who will make decisions and they'll lose their family. Some people will lose lucrative financial opportunities. Some people will lose the approval of all their friends. And some will even lose their life. But what have you decided is worth dying for? Those decisions will be what gets you across the chicken line. And lastly, I would just say, discern what is it that you have to face if you're going to step into it. You know what your Achilles heel is when God calls you to take bold steps of faith. Is it your fear? Is it your temptation to procrastinate? Is it your image that you're afraid for people to see you in a different light? Is it that you want people's approval too much? What is it? Maybe even now you would say, God, I'm going to need courage. And courage is going to come through prayer and seeking you about areas that I feel insecure and unable to handle. The beautiful thing is courage is not the absence of fear. It's finding God's grace to be bigger than your fear. God has a divine destiny for you in hundreds of ways. Doors are opening all the time. Many of us don't see them because we haven't prepared. Are you ready to step into your divine destiny? I know you are. God bless you. Amen.